Senator Sterle. Senator Back.
And what a disappointment Senator Sterle is going to leave us, because I was going to refer to some comments of the then Secretary of the Transport Workers Union of Western Australia in regard to the performance of one Alana McTiernan and her role as Transport Minister. And of course, before he leaves, Acting Deputy President, that official was none other than now Senator Glenn Sterle. But I won't be addressing that for some time, Senator Sterle, so if you're on your way, you might as well go on your way, because it's going to be about 10 minutes into my contribution before I actually get to roll that one out again. But Acting Deputy President, in 2008, I was a candidate in the state election for the seat of Alfred Cove. And do you know, the Labor Premier was Mr Carpenter. We didn't have a leader, as Senator Smith knows. Troy Buswell was on his way. Colin Barnett had made a decision to retire and he came back in. And do you know the complete program that we ran? Do you know what we actually said to the people of Western Australia by way of launching our campaign? Name us 5 things Labor have done in government. And do you know, Mr Acting Deputy President, they couldn't. The people of Western Australia couldn't name 5 things Labor had done in government. Now, Senator Smith sits here, and if I am wrong, I ask him to stand up and correct me. And of course, why did we end up winning the election? For 2 reasons. First of all, nobody could name what Labor had done in government, and it is true what Senator Sterle says, they retained their AAA credit rating because they didn't do anything. And the second thing was Mr Carpenter at the time, the Premier of the state, had within his right to control and nominate the date of the election. And he could have said it's going to be on Saturday the 9th or 10th of February 2009, but did he? No. Why? I'll tell you why. He was an opportunist. He knew his government had achieved nothing in his time or that of his predecessor, with the exception, I will say, of then Minister McTiernan, a competent minister. I agreed with the statements that the then Secretary of the Transport Workers Union, Mr Glenn Sterle, said about Alana McTiernan, but she was competent and she achieved something. But she was the only one in their government that did. So what did Mr Carpenter do, Acting Deputy President? Believing the chaos that he thought existed in our party, he called the election for the middle of September 2008, thinking he would get us offside. Well, one thing was right, and that was Labor had twice the amount of money that we had. But what poor old Alan Carpenter forgot to take into account was that the first 2 weeks of the campaign were the Beijing Olympic Games, in which whatever message went out from Mr Carpenter was buried in the euphoria of the Games. Not even his strategist, Mr Jim McGuinty, knew that Alan Carpenter was going to go to that early election. So by the time the Games were finished, the game was on. Acting Deputy President, the game was on. We both had the same amount of money. Colin Barnett, of course, had gathered us together. He's a man of enormous integrity. The years that he had had in government, in opposition, as Minister for Regional Development, as Minister for Economic Development, as my Minister when I was Chief Executive of Rottnest Island. He was my Minister for Tourism, which was where I first came to understand the intellect of the man. I must say, his intolerance for fools. And Senator Smith and I would both agree that one of Colin's weaknesses is that not only is he highly intolerant of fools, but he has a bit of difficulty in actually concealing it. I was talking to him the other day, and I reminded him, I said, do you remember in that campaign, Ben Morton, Mr Ben Morton, the now member for Tangney, new to the role, came from Eastern Australia. Now he's a confirmed Western Australian, fortunately. But he was the new state director, and Ben Morton came up with this idea. He wasn't there 5 minutes, but he had woken up to the fact that Labor had done nothing in government. And he ran the campaign. I said to Colin Barnett the other day, Colin, if we asked people today whether they like you or not, whether they like the Liberal Party or not, to name 20 things you have done in government, I tell you what, Acting Deputy President, they would get RSI writing out the number of things that the Barnett government has achieved. Poor old Senator Sterle, he's going to go now, but I am going to get to his comments about Alana McTiernan in her time when I get to speak of the Row 8 and Row 9 campaigns. But one of the very first things he did was the undergrounding of the railway, if you remember, through you, Acting Deputy President, to Senator Smith. They'd talked for about 100 years about undergrounding the railway in the centre of Perth. Who did it? Barnett. Did it cost? The benefit to the city has been the sale of the land on top of that area, the reconnection of the city with the area to the north. You see, Acting Deputy President, you know this, and I think those in the gallery know it, that yes, you incur debt in this world. We all have debt. We have a debt to have a home. We might have a debt to have a car. But you see, there's two types of debt. There's debt that creates assets, and there's debt that damns you in liabilities. And I am going in my contribution thanking Senator Gallagher for the opportunity this afternoon. I intend alerting the wider community to the miserable circumstance that the Labor government of Mr Rudd, Ms Gillard and Mr Rudd left this country as a result of the squandering of what was a surplus handed to them on a silver plate, not through debt with the creation of assets that create you further wealth, but the debt that damns you to the $360 billion that we inherited from Mr Rudd in 2013. But for those of you that need to get a handkerchief out in the gallery, you need to know this. It's not so much the debt that's costing you today and our inability to do a lot of the things we talk about. It's the fact that we're paying... let me rephrase that, Acting Deputy President. It's the fact that we are borrowing overseas $400 million a day, $1.2 billion a month. Now you would think, oh, well, you know, if Australia's doing that to pay the debt back, isn't that a good idea? But no. As Senator Smith knows, he's cried out over this. We're not paying the $1.2 billion a month on the debt repayment, Acting Deputy President. We're paying it to pay the interest on the debt. The $1.2 billion a month, the $400 a day, 30 days of every month, goes out the gurgler like it does. If you've got a credit card debt, you must pay. If you've got a mortgage on your home, you know you've got to pay the interest. And that's where we find ourselves in this country today. Mr Costello, typical of Labor governments, Mr Costello inherited a $96 billion debt from the previous government, Mr Keating. He said to me one day, he said, Chris, when we paid the $96 billion back, and incidentally didn't sell anything, didn't sell any Australia Posts to pay back the $96 billion, he just did it through economic rigidity and stability. But he said to me, he said, we had $6 billion then that used to go out in interest that we could now put back into the Australian economy. Imagine today that $1.2 billion a month. Imagine if we had 15 or 16 billion that we could just be putting back into services. I'll tell you what it equates to, that 1.2 billion. It equates to the new Children's Hospital, the one that Mr Barnett has just finished the completion of. That's one lousy month's interest on the debt. That's the hospital that Mr Barnett has built. The Fiona Stanley Hospital, arguably in the words of doctors I have spoken to in recent days, the most modern hospital in the world, about 6 weeks' interest on the debt. Do you know we could be building 2 new primary schools a day, 7 days a week, if we weren't repaying that interest on the debt? And of course that brings me not just to the Fiona Stanley Teaching Hospital and the new Children's Hospital that Premier Barnett has been responsible for, but no less than in the rural areas of WA, the ones that I represent, and Senator Smith, 37 new hospitals in the time Barnett's been in government. In the Wheat Belt, the South West, the Great Southern, the Midwest, the Pilbara. In towns like Merredin and Northam and Narrogin, new hospitals being developed, 23 small hospitals. and we're invited to think that the Barnett government hasn't done anything? Let me tell you a little bit more about assets versus liabilities, because I'm going to get on to the liabilities of the federal government, where they wasted your money and yours, Acting Deputy President. Colin Barnett, in a visionary manner, has reclaimed the Swan River back up to the city. It had always been river, it was reclaimed, and he's brought it back up to the city and created what's called Elizabeth Quay, so that we've got this absolutely world-leading capitalised facility now, right at the base of the city. And you know, all the critics, Acting Deputy President, said, $440 million, what a shock, what a shock, what a debt he's incurred in doing this, in creating the most phenomenal facility. Do you know, the other day he sold the last block that's available as part of the commercial development, and he's already got $390 million of the $440 million back in the kick. You see, that's what expenditure of money on assets creates. Only recently did I have the pleasure, on behalf of the Federal Transport Minister, to open a section of the Forest Highway Kwinana Freeway, right beside that Auburn Grove railway station that Senator Sterle was asking, would it ever be built? Is it ever likely to be there? Well, it's bad luck that Senator Sterle doesn't get perhaps into those areas a bit more often, because Senator Smith, it was right beside where our Minister Marmion and I opened the $120 million freeway. It's there, it's finished, the Auburn Grove railway station. But I was able to say proudly at that time how phenomenal it is that the Barnett government, with the support of federal funding, has completed the Great Eastern Highway extension out to the airport, has completed the multi-billion-dollar Gateway Road project around the international and domestic airports, has built the Forest Highway down into the southwest, down into our Margaret River, Dunsborough recreation areas, attendant upon all of the increased business in tourism and in mining and in agriculture. But I was also able to say, Acting Deputy President, that through that excellence of the combination of Western Australian and federal funding, each of those projects has been completed under budget, under time, and at least, if not equal to, but superior to the quality that was contracted. So that's what the Barnett government is achieving in Western Australia. Now, I wasn't always in favour of a new football stadium, but most Western Australians are. Now, we looked at South Australia, that beautiful facility you've now got in the Adelaide Football Oval, and you looked at the old heap of garbage that exists at Subiaco Oval, and yes, there are some people don't always want every project. But as I said to somebody the other day when he was complaining about the debt incurred, I said to him, mate, just tell me which project you didn't want. Tell me about Elizabeth Quay you didn't want. Tell me about roads to the north of the state you didn't want. Tell me about roads that are now more safe. Tell me about hospitals and schools, and tell me about all those infrastructure projects you don't want. And this joker said, Chris, I want every one of them. And you see, that's the difficulty in today's world. So yes, the Barnett government has incurred debt. I now want to turn attention to where the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments incurred the debt that the Australian taxpayers will be paying back well beyond the time of their children and their grandchildren. Remember, Rudd came into government with no debt, the only country in the OECD that had no debt. No deficits, we were in surplus. $40 or $50 billion sitting in the bank earning interest. So what did he do with it? Well, he chucked it out on $900 and $1,200 cheques. That was successful. People who died got them. People in prison got them. Backpackers who'd paid tax the previous year back in Switzerland, they got their $900 cheques. My aged mother, wheelchair-bound in a nursing home, she got both the $900 and the $1,200. And do you know where most of the money went? We know this as a result of Senate inquiries and joint inquiries, Acting Deputy President. Three main sources it went into: Drugs and alcohol, evidenced by the increase in accident and emergencies at all of Australia's major hospitals on those 2 Friday nights. Poker machines, as evidenced in evidence to us in the Mr Wilkie inquiry onto mandatory pre-commitment, and of course Chinese TVs. So that was the first great effort by the Rudd government. Was there any money spent on asset development like exploration for mining that might actually lead to some more employment and some more wealth? Oh, no Labor government ever spends money on asset creation. They don't know it. So what was next? Next was the Gillard Memorial Halls. Now, I chaired the Senate Education, Employment, Workplace Relations Committee at that time, and for my sins, I was for 9 years on the Catholic Education Commission of Western Australia. So I know a little bit about spending Commonwealth government monies, because the Commonwealth gives the independent and Catholic schools money, and we spend that money, acting Deputy President, down to the last dollar, because it's so rare to get it. But we sat there and watched as states like New South Wales, Victoria, not so much Victoria, they had the sense to not spend the money initially. And that was fairly unusual, because the whole purpose of spending, of giving it to them, was to create economic activity. So Victoria didn't do the spending, but at least they didn't waste as much money. The other states all did. So it's about 13 or 14 billion on the Gillard Memorial Halls. I better move on, otherwise I won't get through them. The $2.8 billion of the pink bats. Do you remember that? People going up and down streets saying, oh, we've put pink bats there, there and there, sending in a bill, and the Labor government paid the bill. The unfortunate thing was, I think 4 young people regrettably were killed as a result of the dereliction in terms of oversight of those young people in roofs. But more importantly, people were saying, no, I'm sorry. When it all came out and there was a Royal Commission and they went back and said, we better go back and address ourselves, officers knocked on doors and they said, oh, Mrs Fogg-Knuckleditch, we're here to check on the pink bats for which the Australian taxpayer paid $1,600 to some charlatan. And Mrs Fogg-Knuckleditch said, nobody's been to my home to put pink bats. So that was $2.8 billion, plus the other costs associated with further compensation. We know, of course, there was the infamous mining tax. You know, some of us from the West actually know a bit about the mining industry. And to give him credit, the then Shadow Minister Matthias Cormann stood up here and said to the now Leader of the Opposition, Senator Wong, again and again and again and again, you will make no money out of the mining tax. It'll be the first ever tax which is going to cost you more than you got back. And indeed, that happened. So that was a bit more expenditure on liabilities. We had the carbon tax offsets that went out up in smoke. We had the Green Loan Scheme, another $175 million. You see, that's the difference between a Barnett government and a Labor government. A Barnett government, with the assistance of a coalition government from Canberra, will spend its resources and those of the Australian taxpayer on assets, whereas, of course, a Labor government will squander them. Your money, not government money, your money. I conclude with my contribution to the Roe Highway, going through an area very close to where I live and indeed where my electorate office exists. Roe 8 and Roe 9. Now, I did mention many years ago this project should have been completed, but a then state Labor government, with the Minister, Ms Alana McTiernan, the local member for Fremantle at the time, Mr Jim McGuinty, they decided they'd put a spoke in the wheel. They rezoned the land residential and they started selling it. And as I promised, I did say that the biggest critic at the time from a transport point of view, heavy transport, was none other than the highly respected and a person I regard as a personal friend, now Senator Glenn Sterle, who was the Secretary of the Transport Workers Union in WA and that time, and he resoundingly criticised Ms McTiernan. So here we are today, building Roe 8 and Roe 9, a project mainly funded out of federal government funds because Infrastructure Australia has said and concurred how critically important that project is, one that will add immeasurably to safety, one that will cut down travelling time, and yes, the heavy industry will pay a little bit of a toll. Not residential cars won't pay a toll, but the trucking industry will pay a bit in consideration of the enormous savings they will make. I can only thank Senator Gallagher for the opportunity, Acting Deputy President, to highlight why Western Australians must re-elect a Barnett-led government.
Thank you, Senator.